Let's try a different non-graphical component, and in this case I'd like to add a little bit of fun functionality, and that is I'd like my form to fade out when I close it as opposed to just disappearing. The key to making this happen is the opacity property of the form itself. By default it's 100%, but I can make that be a smaller number and have the form appear more transparent. By reducing that value at regular intervals, the form appears to fade out. How do you make something happen at regular intervals? To do that, you need to add the timer component, which is way down here. There it is under Components. We have a timer component. By adding a timer component and having its interval properties set to the length of time between the times you want to run your code. I'll set it to 200 milliseconds so it runs every 1/5 of a second. The enabled property is set to false. If it was true, as soon as we open the form, the timer's tick event handler would start running every 200 milliseconds. I want it to be not enabled, so the code only runs when we first attempt to close the form. Well, let's see how this works. I'll double-click the timer to go to its default event handler, the tick event handler. And the tick event handler handles the tick event of the timer. You can see it here. And let's come and add some code. Now, in order for this to work, I need to know whether or not it's okay for the form to currently be closed. To do that, I'll create a private variable named OKToClose as Boolean and ensure that its value is false. The default value is false, but I've set it to false explicitly so that I'm sure by looking at this code that this form is not currently okay to close. Now, what do we do inside this timer tick event handler? We're going to decrease the opacity of the form by 5%. The minus equals operator says every time this code runs, subtract 5% from the value and put it back into the property. Now, of course, if the opacity is currently less than 5%, then I do want to close the form. So I'll set the OKToClose value equal to true and explicitly close the form. And that's all the code we need in that tick event handler. We also need some code that runs when you attempt to close the form. Let's go back to our form, select the form, go to its Events tab, and find the form closing event. There it is. This is the event that occurs when you attempt to close the form by any means. I'll double-click to load up that event handler, and you'll see that it, like every other event, receives two parameters. The first one indicates the object that caused this to occur, that is the form itself. The second one is E, which is of a special type, form closing event args, and it has a property, E dot, the cancel property, which allows us to cancel the closing of the form. We only want to do that if the OKToClose variable is currently not true. So what we need here, if it's not OKToClose, then we want to do something. That's the same as saying if OKToClose equals false, but we generally don't compare Booleans. We just use the Boolean value or not the Boolean value. So if not OKToClose, that means if it's not currently OKToClose, then we will cancel the closing. So the form doesn't close. Instead, we'll enable timer 1. And what does enabling timer 1 do? It starts this code running every 1/5 of a second. When it runs enough time so the opacity is less than 5%, then it sets OKToClose to true, explicitly attempts to close the form, which will cause this event handler to run again. This will check to see, oh, it is okay to close, and so it just lets the form close. That's how this code works. It's a little complicated. You may need to investigate it a couple times to see how it's working, but let's run it and see if it does work. Here we go. I pressed F5 to run our project. Here's our form. Now if I attempt to close the form, first here by clicking this X, say, what's going to happen? At that point, the form closing event handler will run. It will see that it's not currently okay to close. It will trigger the timer to start ticking, which will decrease the opacity until the opacity gets so small that the tick event says, okay, it's okay to close, and then tells the form to close explicitly. The form closing at this point says, oh, it's okay to close, and just lets the form close. Let's try it. Form starts fading away until it's all the way down to nothing, and then it actually does close. And when the form closes, we go back to Design View in Visual Studio. So we've seen a number of different events happen in this section. We've looked at the click event of a button. We've looked at the click event of a menu item. We've looked at the tick event of a timer. So we've looked at each of these events to see how they can make your application actually add some functionality at runtime.